terms, like these are usually the ones when even when I have a face-to-face class and students are looking for examples in magazines and they're like, what does silhouetting mean again? And I'm like, look at the vocabulary because I'm not giving you quizzes. So when I ask you to find like these examples in magazines and things like that, that's kind of like a visual quiz because I want you to be able to visually recognize these concepts and understand them and not just, memorize them for a quick quiz. Okay, so you have the vocabulary, and then this is the PowerPoint. We're going to go through this together. So in this, we're going to talk about light and value and how it can play several different roles in a work of art. And just like we talked about with line and shape. So we talk about light, and we assume that light is white, but it's actually made up of all the colors in the spectrum, which you've all probably seen and talked about the spectrum in maybe your science classes, as well as your art classes. And so before we talk about color, we're going to talk about value first because it does affect how we see things, and it can also affect how things appear, and how the art, how it's used, can also affect how it makes us feel as we look at a work of art. So depending on the type of value used in a work of art, it can affect our moods, it can affect our mental abilities, and in real life, these things are true too. If you think about different stores that you shop at, usually like higher end stores, they want you to take your time and they have more expensive items. Usually the lights are softer and dimmer, and even in their like dressing rooms, they'll be really soft and dim, and it's because that type of light makes things look, they make you look better, right? And in stores where things are maybe less expensive, and they want you to buy maybe more than expected, like grocery stores and places like that, they're usually flooded with bright light that kind of gives you a feeling of anxiety, and we tend to be more compulsive in environments like that. And I know some of you may be thinking like, they don't do that. I promise they do. When I was in grad school, one of the jobs I had was I was a shoe salesman at a department store called Mervyn's. It's kind of like a Kohl's, but it went out of business in Texas. And when I worked there, I eventually worked my way up as a manager while I was in school. And when I was a manager, I was in charge of merchandising and putting all the stuff from the trucks we got onto the sales floor. And each month I got a packet of information from our district office saying where to put what materials and why. And it would say like your average customer is a 34-year-old female with 2.5 kids. Her favorite color is red, and she graduated high school in this year. Here's a CD that will only play on your CD player with music from when this person was in high school. Put all the red items on the aisle and at each department, and play this CD, throughout the day. And basically, they knew all that information from the surveys that we take whenever we get them on our receipts, whenever we shop. And so they knew that if they had, when we're in high school, that's when we most connect to music emotionally, and it's the most nostalgic to us. And so they knew that if they played music from that person's high school days when they were in the store, they had their favorite color on the outside of every department when you're walking around the store, that's going to make that person go buy more stuff. So if you're ever in a store and you're like, my favorite color is everywhere and my favorite music from high school is playing, realize you're probably their customer. They're a customer that spends the most money. So there are so many studies that are based upon just these kind of things. So in art and just in life also, value can affect how things appear. You may be walking around the lake at North Lake once we reopen again, and you may see this little deer on the left. And yes, we do have wildlife at North Lake. I've seen coyotes, I've seen rabbits, I've seen bobcats, I've seen, I think I saw a deer there once. But pretty much everything we've had it on campus because we have those woods and the golf courses around. But if you saw this little deer, you probably wouldn't be scared. You'd probably think, oh, that's cute. It looks like Bambi. But if you see this image on the right at night, you'd probably be like, well, that could be a deer or the chupacabra or, a demon, I don't know. So depending on how the light is and the value is, it may be, it affects how we see things, and it can affect our perception of things. Same thing with art. Now, this is a three-dimensional piece of art here, but I wanted you to see that even with three-dimensional art, not only do they have to think about just the value that they use in their work, but also like cast shadows. And so whenever Daniel French created the Lincoln Memorial, originally he wanted it to be lit with natural light. But at certain times of the day, the way the light was, Lincoln's face would look like this image on the left. And you can see he looks kind of startled, almost like someone just snapped a picture of him without asking permission first. Where this on the right is what he wanted it to look like, because he just assumed the light will always be overhead, creating these kind of cast shadows under his brow bones. And so eventually he had to figure out a way to use artificial lights to have above, so that there was always this kind of stern look that he wanted to have. So there's a lot of things like that we have to think about. If you've ever walked through, if you had taken classes at Northlake before we went into quarantine, we used to have shows like once a month. We would have different shows in our gallery, and our gallery manager, you would see him, usually once a month down there installing a new show. And the putting the artwork, that's the easy part, hanging it on the wall. The hard part is he then has to go around and move all the lights on the ceiling to illuminate each piece of art and make sure that they're all lit evenly, that there's no weird shadows or bright highlights on areas. And so there's a lot of things like that we don't really think about when we walk through museums and galleries, that's a big part of how we view art. Now, here is a value scale, and you're going to be creating some value scales for homework in your sketchbook, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. But I want to show you like how important it is to get values right in your artwork. If you don't, it can make everything look off. So here we have what appears to be a bigger rectangle that gradates from black to white in the background, and then we have this gray one that also appears to go from light to dark in the middle. But if you look closer, you can actually see that this middle gray rectangle is all the same. And so it only appears to be darker on this side because it's surrounded by a lighter value. So what does this mean? Well, if you don't get your values right in your drawings or paintings or whatever it is that you're creating, it could create an illusion like this that's not natural in your work. So we're going to work this week and next week on sharpening our value skills through our sketchbook assignment and our project that we do. So like I said, value is the term we use to describe light and dark in artwork. Achromatic is another word we use to describe color schemes without color, and that's what that word means. The prefix a means without, and chroma means color or hue. So achromatic color scheme would be black and white or browns, like neutrals as well. And then chromatic grays would be grays that have color added to them. Now, artwork does not always need color to be good. There's a lot, sometimes you don't want to use color. And so sometimes by using just value, it can be even more powerful or more emotional, depending on what it is you want to convey. So with color and value, there is a close connection, and we'll be talking about color eventually. And one thing I want you to realize is that colors have values. So whenever you think of black and white movies or black and white television shows, back during those times, people weren't wearing black and white clothing. They were wearing bright colors, makeup, everything. But they would have to look and see how that translated onto film. And so sometimes they would have to really play up the contrast of value with like a different, maybe in real life, the colors would look off, but on screen it would look, more of what they were going for. So different colors have different values. If you take a black and white photo of the color wheel, you'll see purple has like the darker value, where yellow would be a lighter value. So you can kind of communicate color, even if something's black and white, you can still kind of communicate a sense of color where people can kind of use their imagination by how you use value. So now we're going to get into some of the concepts you're going to be looking for your sketchbook homework. So you may want to kind of pay attention to this part especially. So one is high key or low key patterns, basically. So high key means that whenever objects, they have like mid value to mostly light, bright highlights. And so it's really kind of flooded with light. If it's an outdoor scene, it's going to look like it's a really sunny day, usually. Now, up until the Renaissance, through most of the Renaissance, that's all that they painted was high key compositions for the most part. Why? I think because they were trying to match reality so much, and that's when they could see things clearly, that's when they made most things where it looked like it was daylight outside. And so you'll see like even like a lot of the early religious art, you'll always see things are happening during the daytime. So here's a painting and you can see Jesus and St. Peter, and it just looks like this bright sunny day. And it's nice, like there's great perspective, it's really bright. But do you see how like that kind of always makes things feel super happy? And that wasn't always the case in the stories that were being depicted. So what do we do over time? We hope to get better, right? Sometimes that doesn't happen with everybody, but it happened in early art because I think people were mastering things, and then the next group of artists would come and say, well, I'm going to master that too, but what can I add to make it better? So the period that followed the Renaissance, that was called the Baroque era. And the word Baroque means like irregular pearl. I don't know why it was used to describe that era, but it's the period kind of following the Renaissance where artists still mastered the wonderful techniques that were discovered during the Renaissance, but they added more to it. And what most of the Baroque artists added was drama. And how do you add drama? You make it more moody. You make the composition more dynamic. And so that's what the Baroque artists did. And this is a painting by Caravaggio, who's one of the most famous Baroque artists. And there was an exhibit that had several of his pieces at the Kimball recently, like right when quarantine started happening. I didn't get to see it, but I'd seen some of his pieces before. But Caravaggio worked in this technique called tenebriism, where he used mostly like really dark values, but then just a few little highlights, but almost everything was just really dark. And so low key is where things are mostly dark, mostly just all dark values to midtones, where it feels really kind of moody and dark. And so this is also a biblical story. But notice we have the person that this is about, instead of being in the center of the painting well lit, here we have him on the ground and he's reaching up, but it creates more energy. And this was supposed to be the conversion of St. Paul, I believe. And you can see this is supposed to be the moment in the biblical story where he was cast off his horse and saw like the light and became one of the apostles. And so you see him, and notice the horse's leg almost looks like a lightning bolt that's leading down to him. And so it adds even more kind of energy to the piece. So here we have high key and then low key. And then we can then apply those terms to a lot of different artwork. So here we have two Mark Rothko paintings. We'll talk more about him when we get to color, but obviously this one is more low key because it's just gray and black, where this one is brighter, right? It's got those warmer, brighter colors on the color wheel, so we would call it high key. This one, it's kind of, I would say it's a little bit more kind of in the middle, but I would probably say more low key because it is kind of darker values and there's no really bright whites in it anywhere. This one's definitely low key. In a lot of movies, usually a lot of dramas, they'll have a balance of really low key and high key scenes. Usually the high key scenes will be like whenever something good happens, and then the low key scenes will be when it's like sexy time or something mysterious happening or a challenge. And then in a lot of comedies, what do we see? High key, right? So if you think about it, a lot of the comedies that you watch, or romantic comedies, you'll see mostly it's always during the daytime where things are really brightly lit, bright colors, things like that. So we use this in movies quite a bit as well. So value can do a lot of different things. It can help create an emotional response by being, creating a mood. Values can help us create a focal point, sometimes through contrast. It can suggest more of a sense of three-dimensional space by, using gradation and blending. It can also create a sense of depth, what we call atmospheric perspective. And as we get better at working with value, we get better at shading, hatching and cross-hatching, and then hopefully eventually you'll be able to draw in a technique where you don't see any harsh lines at all. And this term here is chiaroscuro, which is an Italian word that means light and shadow. And literally that's what it translates to. But we use it more as a word that describes artwork where you don't see any harsh lines. Okay. So a lot of those are going to be things you'll have to find examples for in magazines as well. And we're going to go through each one now. So here we can see The Dark Knight in this little movie poster. And it's definitely, what do we call this? Low key, right? But it's also really moody because it's so dark. Just like these Baroque paintings, this makes us feel like this strong kind of moodiness that adds to the feel of the movie. This is a painting here from the Baroque era also, and this is from an artist named Artemisia Genskaletti. And this, I believe, this painting was at that Kimball show as well. And Artemisia Genskaletti was one of the first, I would say, feminist painters in throughout our history. And I don't know if that was a word back then or anything like that, but her life story was pretty amazing. She grew up under her father, who was an artist, and he had kind of taught her everything. During that time period, women did not have many opportunities. They could become a wife, a nun, or basically a prostitute. Those were like the real options. If they wanted to study art, they could study art under their fathers or their husbands, but they were not permitted to paint or create certain subject matter. And they could only make art after they did, like their other wifely or duties that they had to do, like cleaning and things like that. Not my point of view at all. That's just the way things were during that time. Well, so she decided, she was like, I just want to, study under my father, but he trained her for a while, and he was only had so many sets of skills that he told her, there's not much I can do, and you can't really make a living at this, without being married or something like that. Like, I just don't think that this is, you're gonna have to find something else. So why don't you become a nun? So she tried that, and it wasn't really what was working out for her. And so she eventually quit being a nun, and her father was like, I know you're unhappy. Let me see what I can do. And so he figured out a way for her to study under this other master artist that was way skilled than him. And so she was a teenager. She went to go live with this other artist and study under him in secret. And it's rumored that he stole several of her sketches, because back then the way you would get big commissions is you would mail or send your drawings for big projects that you were doing, that they were going to do. And with a lot of the female artists, they believed that they would just take the sketches, and a male artist sometimes would just take their ideas, and there was nothing done about it. So there was rumor that that was happening with some of her work. And then he raped her, and she went and told her father, and her father was like, I'm sorry, but we can't really do anything about this because you weren't supposed to be there. And she's like, I don't care. And so she took the artist to court, and sadly, the court shamed her, and they like blamed her. And that's a horrible story. It's sad and horrible. But what happens whenever you've been deemed you know, um, like you've been marked, basically, then you can kind of do whatever you want, right? And so at that point, she said, well, now I don't have to do any of these other things. My reputation is kind of ruined, so I'm going to paint whatever I want. And so she started painting biblical scenes and mythological scenes and historical scenes of strong, powerful women. And one of those scenes that she painted more than once was called the death of Hollis, which is a story from the Bible about Judith and one of her servants that snuck into an enemy's camp, and they seduced and beheaded the leader that was having an army that was killing like all of their, you know, the men that were from their area. And so here we see that most climatic point of that story of Judith holding his head down and cutting his head off with a sword. And there's no weakness in this at all except in the man. And you can see her holding the sword like it's nothing. And that what looks like hair is actually arterial spray coming from beheading him. And it's pretty disturbing, I know, really graphic. And she painted that twice. Like, I guess she just really felt that story. So you can see, had this been all really brightly lit, like this, it would not have the same feeling. So having that darker, low-key value range really added to the mood and the sort of energy of this piece. So value can also help create a focal point. Here, with having mostly all these lighter colors in the sky and then this dark shadow under this blimp, it draws our attention to it. So the contrast of value can really help create a focal point. We see the same thing here on this album cover with the kind of more middle grays, and then the bright shoes kind of stand out as a focal point because of the contrast of value. Here we see how value can suggest a third dimension. These are all drawings with pencil or charcoal. The image on the left is actually a drawing by Michelangelo, the famous Renaissance artist, and it was a study for part of the Sistine Chapel ceiling that he painted. And he really had to think about value and how from, you know, way up in the sky that you would be able to see, you know, these figures where they wouldn't look flat from the ground. And so he really had to you know, add more, I think, value contrast to create that illusion. And then here, this is an assignment that some of my colleagues did at this other school I worked at, where they would take folded paper and put it on top of other paper, and then they would have their students draw that. So this is not three-dimensional, this is all pencil. And you can see how by getting all those values just right, it looks very three-dimensional. Here we can see these paintings are very three-dimensional looking because the value was rendered so well. So how do you get better at that? Well, you do what's called value studies, and you're going to be doing a simple value study in your sketchbook for homework, and you'll also be doing some value scales that will help with that as well. But one of the things you can do is just study like basic geometric forms. So if you have like jars or boxes around your house, you know, you could just look at the most simplest form and just look at how the light falls on them, especially if you can control the light, having it come from just one angle. So in light and shadow, there's 6 points. The highlight, the light, the shadow, the core of the shadow, the reflected light, and then the cast shadow, which is the darkest. So the highlight is always the brightest point, and the cast shadow is always the darkest point. And in my drawing classes, I always tell students, like whenever they're drawing like a still life setup, or you know, they're working from a photo or whatever, I always just say try to find like the brightest area first and kind of make note where that is, and then the darkest areas, and then know that everything else is kind of somewhere in between, and that will kind of help you not get too dark or too light in other places. So we can also create a value, helps create a sense of atmospheric perspective. As things get further away from us, they, well, depending on the day, they can get darker or lighter, but they kind of fade. And usually colors closer to us are more rich, and so it can help create a sense of depth. if you have like more darker kind of catch shadows and things on objects closer to you, but then everything kind of fades to the color of the sky and into the distance. And we'll talk more about atmosphere perspective when we get to the chapter over space. All right, so like I said, the more that you look at value closely, the better you'll get at shading, the better you'll get at hatching and cross-hatching. Cross-hatching is when lines cross each other, and the lines are used to suggest different values. And then hatching is when those lines go in just one direction. And so I think you're going to have to do some of that in your homework too. So you can see, like, by cross-hatching, you can really create what looks like almost like blending from far away. And you can see that in this portrait here. From a distance, it looks really soft and blended, but up close, you can see all the little hatching lines. Chiaroscuro, like I said, is when you learn to blend where you don't have any harsh lines. And in most drawing classes, you'll spend a lot more time with value working with doing this with charcoal, graphite, and possibly other materials. And you'll do several value studies and things like that look a lot like this. We're just going to draw like a simple object for a value study for our homework in this class, and then you'll be doing some value scales. But I think every class I took in college, whether it was painting or drawing or design or whatever, we always had to do some project that focused on value, whether it was in paint or charcoal or whatever. So you may encounter this at some point. I even had a professor at UT, Tyler, that he never really did demos or gave lectures. He would just tell us, go paint. And this was like an upper level painting class, but he would come in to class, and he would just come in late every time, like more than 30 minutes late. And we would all be painting, and we worked on the walls, like on all four sides of the room. And he would come in and just walk from person to person, telling you how bad you were. And we were always just looking around the room at each other like, what is he talking about? He didn't even give us any assignments, but he just, he would tell us, do what you want to do, and I'll tell you what's wrong with it. And one semester, it was towards the beginning, he came in and we were all already working on pretty big paintings. And he came in, he looked disgusted at us, and then he went out and got his trash can, and he came back and he just took all of our colored paint and he just started throwing it in the trash, and then he took it back to his office. And then he came back in and just started walking around talking to each student like nothing happened. And I think finally I was like, excuse me, sir, why did you take all of our colors away? Because he left our black and white paint, but just he took the colors. And he was like, oh, none of you know how to use color correctly, so you have to work with just black and white and value the rest of the semester. So you had 15 painting students that had no color, and we were just supposed to figure out how to use black and white paint in interesting ways for like the whole rest of the semester. And so it was kind of fun. It was frustrating, but then whenever I went to grad school and I had to show them my portfolio, I put in some of those black and white paintings I did, and my grad school professor that was looking at my portfolio said those were his favorite paintings. And I was like, no. So maybe there was something to that, learning, without using color, learning how to use value and how to use it in interesting ways. So there are a lot of artists, like I said before, that don't use color because they choose not to. And Käthe Kollwitz is one artist. She was from Germany, and she lived through World War I and World War II. Fortunately, her husband was a doctor, and he was very supportive of her career as an artist. Her primary way of creating art was through printmaking and drawing, and I've never seen any color work by her. And the reason is because growing up during, the world wars in a country that didn't always have, freedom, and especially equality for women, she struggled, and she had a lot of hardships. In World War I, she lost children. In World War II, she lost grandchildren. And so she felt like this overwhelming sense of death and loss and grief. And so she said she chose not to use color because she felt like the color had been taken out of her life. So a lot of her portraits and prints, they look like self-portraits, but really they could become any woman. And she felt like she lived in a man's world, and that no matter how much she raised her children and hoped the best for them, that it was really kind of out of her hands because they were at the fate of the world. And she chose printmaking as a medium because with printmaking you make multiple prints, and so she could kind of use it as propaganda to get her message out there. And I think that's why she's so widely celebrated. But she's one of my most favorite printmakers of all time. And when I was in high school, I remember I had to go to the library to work on a research paper for a class, and I got bored and I wandered over to the art section, and there was a book, I think it was called like Self-Portraits of Artists Throughout History, and there was no description, it just gave the artist's name and it had different self-portraits. And I remember I was probably 15 or 16 at the time, and I opened the book and it was one of her self-portraits where she was looking like right at the viewer. And never up to that point, I didn't grow up around art. I'd never had art that made me feel that sadness or that sick feeling in your stomach, like whenever you see something really awful, like a car wreck or an injured, animal or something like that, or you hear someone, that passed away. Like when I saw her self-portrait, I knew nothing about her, and it just like it hit my soul. And I remember just like getting like teared up, and I was like, why is this lady so sad? And I couldn't stop staring at it. And I checked out the book, and later that day I had art, and I brought it to my art teacher, and I was like, hey, do you know who this artist is? Because like this was before internet or Google, and so we had to actually look things up. And I told my teacher, I was like, I can't find any other books about her in our library. Do you know who she is? And she was like, oh, that's a wonderful artist. You know what? Why don't you go to the city library this weekend and write a paper about it, and then you come and tell me about her life. And so then I had two papers to write, but I learned a lot about her, and I just thought it was interesting how she chose not to use color. So here we see that chiaroscuro that I talked about in Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. You've probably all seen this before. And you can notice, though, there's no lines. And that's one of the things that Da Vinci was a master at. He used a technique that we call now sfumato. And it's where he would apply thin glazes or transparent layers of like smoky paint that would make everything look really soft. Now, contrast is creating dissimilar things and putting them together, and value contrast is doing that with like a light and dark value. And so in web design, graphic design, or visual art, we have enough contrast to see images or to see things if that's what we're going for. So that's something that you'll all probably deal with at some point. And here you can see an artwork with high contrast and then one with lower contrast. And you can see how, I tend to like, higher contrast more for sure. And then Tenebriism, as I said, that was using a lot of black, which is the few highlights and mid values. And we saw that in the Baroque art, but we also see that quite a bit in pop art as well, or pop culture. Andy Warhol, that was kind of his whole process of making his screen prints of celebrities and a lot of his self-portraits. Highlighting is just highlights, like using highlights to kind of grab a focal point. So here we see the brightest point is in this woman's tank top, and it kind of leads us to look at everything else going on. And we see them kind of recreating the Pieta, which is the scene of Mary holding Jesus's dead body, but probably the most famous version you've seen is Michelangelo's sculpture of that. Cast shadows are literally cast shadows. This is a painting, but you can see that by painting, it looks like, imagine there being a window with mini blinds open, and that's what was creating the cast shadows on the wall. But those also kind of work as directional lines leading us to the different people in the composition. Here we can see this is an installation piece that is kind of like a patio, but also a work of art. And we can see that the cast shadows that it creates on the ground is very interesting. Some artists do this inside of galleries. They create these installations that cast shadows around the room, and that's part of the experience. And then silhouetting means, like, if you put a light behind something, it causes, whenever you photograph it, it causes it to be completely blacked out. And I gave you a couple of links, I think, to Kara Walker's work last week, because she does paper cutouts. But not only does she do paper cutouts, there's silhouetted figures. So it almost looks like there's like a light or a sun setting behind them, and that's why we see them in this solid silhouette. And here we see it in movies too. This is a scene from a movie, and you can see obviously the light is all behind the figures, and so they all show up as silhouettes. And you can find so many examples of this in advertising. You'll have no problem finding this in a magazine. And so we see this light being used as a medium all the time, and medium is what you make the art from. But if you think about it, photography and film, they're using light. Photography actually translates to the prefix photo means light, and graphy means writing or drawing. So photography literally means light writing or light drawing. And so movies and film actually use light as the medium to help create the imagery. There's also artists that use actual light bulbs that they arrange in different sculptures and use that as their work of art. Not my favorite thing, but it's interesting. This artist creates neon light, like poetry, and they're actually electrical, and you plug them in. And he's created several installations. They have several of his at the Dallas Museum of Art. And then if you think about it, there are people that do this for a living in the music industry and in performance based arts like drama and plays and dances and things like that. There's one big lighting artist named Brian Hartley that works with big bands, and he creates the choreographed light shows to go with their performances to enhance the music, these big like arena concerts. And if any of you've ever been to like a big concert before, you've probably seen, the lights really do play a big effect on how you perceive all of those things. So that is the lecture for value. And now I'm going to go over your sketchbook exercises with you. All right. So all of the vocabulary that I showed you before, we talked about all of these things in the lecture. And then these are going to be your sketchbook exercises for the week. And again, this is all you have to do this week. You're going to first find samples of these different types of uses of value in magazines or newspapers, and you're going to be cutting those out, putting them in your sketchbook, labeling them, and then like photographing the whole page. So we just went over literally every one of these, and you can go back to the PowerPoint later if you need to get refresh your memory of what those are. Then the second part is you're going to create 7 value scales, and it has the dimensions here. The dimensions are 1 inch by 7 inch for each value scale, and so basically you'll have like 7 1-inch squares next to each other in a row, and you'll do a value scale for hatching, 1 for cross hatching, 1 for stippling, 1 for scribbling, and 1 for shading. And I have next to each one material you should use with it. And I'm going to demonstrate this in just a moment and show you how to do this. Okay. And it tells you leave the first section blank, the white of the paper, and work from light to dark on each scale. And then it says I'll demonstrate that. So I'm going to show you how to do that in just a moment. And then it tells you to sketch one of the following items from home: setting up a still life with your graphite pencils, and shading, trying to create the full range of values. So when I say shading, that means like I don't really want to see lines, okay? So this isn't a line drawing. This is like you taking your time and doing like a little value study. So you can either take like an egg and put it on top of a white piece of paper with like one light source. So you may just turn off all your other lights and have the light just coming from one area, and put a white piece of like printer paper underneath it so that you can see the cast shadows as well. Or you can put a glass that you put water in and put that on top of a piece of paper. And then I have an example of each. So I don't want you drawing the examples. I want you to actually set it up at your house and draw it. But you can see examples here. So I want to see the cast shadows and everything around it too. So it's easier if you put a piece of white paper down, and then you can take like a flashlight or a candle or something, and then turn all the other lights out, and then have your sketchbook, and just with your pencils, your graphite pencils, try to shade this as best you can without drawing any harsh lines, okay? And I mean, I would take probably 15-20 minutes at least to do this drawing, and you can choose to do to do one or the other. But if you want to do both, you can. If you want to just get better, you could try doing both, okay? And then the last thing, it says to watch video clips of black and white films and create 5 preliminary sketches of different video stills from those films that you think have a good composition. And it says these may be modern or classical films. In your search, look for examples of the different value concepts that we talked about, and then I listed them. And then it says you may want to write down like the name of the film and then the clip that you drew, because that's what we're going to be using for our upcoming project next week. Okay, and you could do like 2 or 3 of those per page in your sketchbook. They're kind of like a little bit like thumbnail sketches, but I do want to see the different values in them. So they can be smaller, but I do want to see the different values. They're not just line drawings, okay? And then it says sign and date each page of your sketchbook, photograph each page, upload those images into one Word document, and then submit that on eCampus for grading. And then it says if you took notes from the value lecture or any of the other videos or handouts, you could add a picture of the notes too for a credit. All right. So